Her fingers were cold against his jaw, cool, smooth, and trembling just enough to betray the calm she projected to the rest of the galaxy. Orion caught Lyra's hand before she could pull away. His thumb brushed over the luminescent ridges of her knuckles. Blood ran into his left eye, warm and stinging, but he didn't blink. He just watched the way her breath hitched, the way the ambient light of her skin flared in time with her racing pulse. He was an unshielded Solarian, bleeding out on a polished floor, and all he cared about was making sure she didn't look away. It turned out that showing up to claim Illumina Ascendancy Royal wasn't as simple as signing a treaty. 3 days earlier, a scarred Solarian warship docked at a palace of living light. The contrast alone was enough to make the aristocrats of Xylos Prime sneer. The human vessel was blocky and bruised by micrometeoroid impacts and atmospheric burns. The spires of Xylos Prime were grown from pure crystalline energy, singing in frequencies human ears couldn't even process. Orion hadn't cared about the sneers. He had walked down the boarding ramp, locked eyes with Princess Lyra, and the rest of the galaxy simply ceased to exist. But peace isn't built on a shared glance. Duke Varash made sure of that. The Duke radiated an arrogant violet luminescence, his pride entirely unable to stomach the sight of a fragile, short-lived human standing beside the heir. So he invoked a forgotten tradition, the Aegis Torment, 3 trials of worthiness. The night before Vorish's challenge, Orion and Lyra had stood alone on a balcony overlooking the radiant city. Lyra had leaned her head against his shoulder. A simple gesture, but for a species that communicated through mental resonance, physical touch was staggeringly intimate. She didn't understand why his chest tightened when she hummed softly, and he didn't understand why she kept tracing the jagged shrapnel scar on his forearm, as if reading a sacred text. Truth is, they were speaking a language neither had studied but both understood perfectly. "They will break your mind, Orion," she had whispered, her voice tight, the light dimming along her collarbones. "The torment is designed for telepaths, enduring the unendurable without psionic shields. It is a death sentence." He had just smiled. That infuriating, stubborn human smile. Then they're going to get a front row seat to exactly how loud a human mind can be. And now, the massive gates to the crystalline arena were groaning open. The air tasted of static and dry heat. The psionic amplifiers built into the arena walls were already humming. It wasn't just noise, it was a physical weight pressing against Orion's skull, attempting to force him to his knees before the first blow was even struck. The audience of thousands watched in absolute stillness. For them, this was a formality, a messy execution dressed up as tradition. Borash stood at the center of the pale sand, radiating a blinding, mocking light, waiting to break the fragile human. Orion rolled his shoulders. The psychic pressure made his vision blur, sending a sharp ache down his spine, but the pain grounded him. Pain was an old friend. He reached over his shoulder, his fingers wrapping around a leather-bound hilt. He drew the heavy, unpowered blade, the dull scrape of iron ringing out against the psychic hum. It was a crude, heavy thing, perfectly suited for cutting through millennia of aristocratic arrogance. He didn't have psionics. He didn't have glowing skin. He just had an impossibly stubborn human heart beating a steady, defiant rhythm against his ribs. The psychic hum spiked, driving a white-hot pressure right behind Orion's eyes. Vorish moved first. He didn't run. He shifted, a blur of violet energy crossing the sand faster than human biology should be able to track. A blade of hard light swept toward Orion's neck. Orion dropped. The heat of the mist singed the short hairs on his nape. He brought the heavy iron sword up in a brutal, ungraceful arc. It didn't slice cleanly through the air like the Lumina weapons. It dragged. It possessed weight. It caught Vorish's blowing blade with a metallic scream that rattled the teeth of every spectator in the front rows. Truth is, Vorish was stronger, faster. His mind was a weapon designed to crush resistance before a physical blow ever landed. But human endurance is a different kind of machinery. It is built on the stubborn refusal to stop breathing. Vorash struck again, driving a psychic pulse straight into Orion's chest. Orion stumbled, his knee hitting the pale sand hard enough to crack bone. The sudden taste of copper flooded his mouth. His vision swam. Through the blur he found the royal box. He found her. Lyra stood frozen, her light dimming to a terrified pale silver. She was watching him die, and the space between them felt like a physical tearing in his chest. He wasn't going to let her watch him die. Orion pushed off the broken knee. The sheer irrational momentum of it caught Vorish completely off guard. The Duke had expected the fragile human mind to shatter. He hadn't expected the human to lunge forward, willingly absorbing a glancing burn from the light blade just to close the distance. The sharp scent of burnt uniform and seared flesh filled the dry air. Orion ignored the screaming nerves in his shoulder. He slammed the heavy iron hilt directly into Vorish's sternum, driving the breath from the alien's lungs. Before the Duke could recover, Orion swept his good leg out, taking Vorish down to the sand in a tangle of limbs. Orion followed the momentum, pinning the larger alien. He pressed the cold, dull edge of the iron blade against Vorish's glowing throat. The arena went entirely still. Thousands of minds, linked in a continuous telepathic network, suddenly went completely quiet. Vorish stared up, his violet light flickering erratically, his chest heaving. He was waiting for the killing stroke. It was the law of the arena. It was the only way their kind understood absolute victory. Orion looked down at the Duke. Blood dripped from his own chin onto Vorish's immaculate chest plate. He thought about the sneers. He thought about the centuries of rigid superiority that had built this beautiful, cruel place. Then he looked up at Lyra again. Her light was shifting, blooming into a warm, desperate gold. He didn't want to build their life on a corpse. Slowly, Orion pulled the iron away. He stood, his bad leg trembling beneath his weight, and took a step back. He offered a bloodied hand down to the Duke. Faraj just stared at the hand, entirely unable to process the gesture. A Solarian, unshielded, broken, and bleeding, had just won the Aegis torment, and he was refusing the kill. Orion didn't wait for the Duke to take it. He turned his back on the deadliest warrior on Xylos Prime, and limped toward the heavy arena gates, toward the woman waiting for him. He didn't look back. It turned out that breaking a system didn't always require tearing down its walls. Sometimes it just required refusing to play by its rules. As the shockwave of what had just happened rippled through the telepathic network of millions, the rigid hierarchy of the Lumina ascendancy fractured. It was a subtle shift at first, but history would record the exact second the galaxy forever changed, by a single act of mercy in the arena. When the gates finally groaned shut behind him, Lyra was there. She didn't speak. She just stepped into his space, her hands finding his waist, burying her face against his uninjured shoulder. Her light wrapped around him, warm and anchoring, gently pulling the residual static from his mind. He dropped the iron sword to the floor, resting his cheek against the top of her head, and finally let out a long, shuddering breath.